We resume in the middle of the 18th chapter, Mind and Supermind. And several pages yet to go. We'll probably take a third session to complete it. So let's take our time and make sure that we enjoy every delicious turn of phrase that Sri Aurobindo offers us. To this point, he's, in this chapter, trying to set the stage for how it is that the dividing features of mind arrive in being and are empowered to act in a way that they do, that results in an actual lapse into ignorance, a kind of self-forgetting, even though mind is born out of the supernal consciousness of the supramental. So how does this separation occur? Because all three principles that are familiar to our existence, mind, life, and body, matter, arrive in this universe embedded in this kind of division, this apparent disintegration of the unity of Satchit-Ananda. So it is important for Sri Aurobindo to account how this can occur so that we don't wind up with an unbridgeable divide between this world in which we're growing and evolving and that world from which we came and towards which we are evolving now. If there were a true separation, a rigid separation, could we ever close that gap? But if there is a secret unity, then there's not only reason for hope, there's reason to get busy and to continue to evolve. So let's start with this paragraph where we left off last time. This essential faculty and the essential limitation that accompanies it are the truth of mind and fix its real nature and action, swabhava and swadharma. Here is the mark of the divine fiat, assigning it its office in the complete instrumentation of the Supreme Maya. The office determined by that which it is in its very birth from the eternal self-conception of the self-existent. Well, there's a great deal in that single sentence. So let's see what we can do to understand some of these terms. The terms swabhava and swadharma, for those of you who are familiar with Sri Aurobindo's essays on the Gita, know that these concepts have a central place in the explanation of the universe and how the soul enters into it. These terms we have not met before yet in the Life Divine. They are of antique origin. Swabhava, I think you can trace that all the way back to the Shvetashvatara Upanishad. And Swadharma goes all the way back to the Maitri Upanishad. And of course, both of them, as I say, occur in the Bhagavad Gita. He has, in a sense, defined them here in a way that he will consistently reinforce even later in the Life Divine when he's adding chapters to the already voluminous work that appeared in the pages of the Arya. So Swabhava would refer to the real nature. Swabhava means one's own being. What a soul originating from that great oneness of Satchit-Ananda would carry from that truth unique to itself, or as its pithy expression. Swadharma, well, dharma, of course, is very difficult to translate properly. We'll call it here what he does, action. It's a law of action, as he would define it later in the Life Divine in the chapter on the Gnostic being. And there's a place in that same chapter where he compresses all of this into a single sentence, which might elucidate what he means. If you don't mind us forecasting a bit. All becomes a self-flow of spiritual self-nature, swadharma of swabhava. So the law of being, the law of action, emerges from the truth of one's being, which is always part of the essence of reality. What is true in you is your self-being, is your swabhava. And its characteristic mode of action in the world is its swadharma. So you get some idea of the intricate constitution of this metaphysical reality, Sat Chit Ananda, an unimaginable oneness, constellates itself in the universe through the principle of the supramental vision. This supramental vision maintains unity and diversity. Each element of that diversity, soul in its highest status, has its own swabhava and its own nature. And then it has its characteristic way of acting, and that becomes its swadharma. This is a meaningful description that we find replicated in the Bhagavad Gita. So Sri Aurobindo can go back both to Upanishad and to the Gita to find ample reinforcement for what is his personal experience of that reality, which he is disposing in terms of philosophy here in these pages of the Life Divine. Even though we meet this term first in the Life Divine, it will eventually, I guess in August of 1916, begin the series called Essays on the Gita. So we meet these terms before he's ever given elucidation to that great text. And they also do not appear in the Synthesis of Yoga until September of 1919, not far off from when he discontinued the entire journal, in a chapter called The Elements of Perfection. But if you go back, you can see that in his record of yoga, he has been writing about these things from 1912 on, especially about the nature of swabhava and how that enters into the picture of one's own self-perfection. So if we meet these terms later, we'll have some sense of their context. And even if they're Sanskrit, it's important, I think, to get a sense of what their meaning is and what their thrust is. So that's those two terms. This essential limitation that he's talking about is the mark of the divine fiat as the creative power of the divine Maya, what he describes here as the supreme Maya, draws from the infinite and constellates that finite cosmos that is the perfect balance of unity and diversity. We're still talking about a primal creation at the level of the divine being, which he has described as being four in aspect. Sat Chit Ananda and the supramental describe the divine being. The supramental is essentially that poise of the Supreme where it becomes Maya and measures out the infinite into finitude. So that essential limitation explains how this diversity comes into being and can eventually lapse into something other. But always it has been conceived within itself in the only existent. Now, to continue with this paragraph, that office is to translate always infinity into the terms of the finite, to measure off, limit, de-piece. Actually, it does this in our consciousness to the exclusion of all true sense of the infinite. Therefore, mind is the notice of the great ignorance, because it is that which originally divides and distributes, and it has even been mistaken for the cause of the universe and for the whole of the divine Maya. So this characteristic of being measured off is a central aspect of our experience of mind, but it is not essential. It is functional at the level of the supramental. But because this is characteristic of the mind, philosophers in India and Vedanta have often accorded the creation of the world to a misconstruction at the level of mind, that it is mind that creates. Sri Aurobindo draws a firm distinction and says, no, at the level of the divine Maya, the supramental consciousness, all this creation is substantial, is real idea, remember? And so, even if there is a distribution, it is not a separating distribution. All remains in the context of the one divine. And to continue here, but the divine Maya comprehends vidya as well as avidya, the knowledge as well as the ignorance. This is almost straight out of the Isha Upanishad. This is the 11th verse of the Isha, and he's translated that in part in an earlier chapter. I think it was the destiny of the individual. But let me read how he translates that so you know how it fits here. Because the divine Maya is both vidya, knowledge, and avidya, ignorance. Here's the Isha. He who knows that as both in one, the knowledge and the ignorance, by the ignorance crosses beyond death, and by the knowledge enjoys immortality. Well, to unpack all of that, we may want to come back to later. I don't want to detain us. We need to cover a lot of material tonight in the Life Divine. But the idea that one can, by accepting the graded ignorance that's presented to our experience, cross beyond death and arrive back at that originating oneness, justifies the universe in the Isha's opinion. And by the knowledge, one enjoys immortality. So, from avidya back to vidya, out of vidya into avidya, but back from that to the other. So rather than rejecting the world, you accept the world and find out what its secret is, and you get to a greater knowledge. And yes, the enjoyment of that immortality that leaves you with a satisfied sense of who you are, whether you're moving in the universe or you're in an ecstatic rapture, ensconced in the divine, immaculate and immobile. So back to Sri Aurobindo. So, but the divine Maya comprehends vidya as well as avidya, the knowledge as well as the ignorance. For it is obvious that since the finite is only an appearance of the infinite, a result of its action, a play of its conception, and cannot exist except by it, in it, with it as a background, itself form of that stuff and action of that force, there must be an original consciousness which contains and views both at the same time, and is intimately conscious of all the relations of the one with the other. So the divine is both the continent and the creator, contains all within itself, even as it steps into the manifestation. In that consciousness, he writes, there is no ignorance, because the infinite is known, and the finite is not separated from it as an independent reality. But still there is a subordinate process of delimitation. Otherwise no world could exist, a process by which the ever-dividing and reuniting consciousness of mind, the ever-divergent and convergent action of life, and the infinitely divided and self-aggregating substance of matter come, all by one principle and original act, into phenomenal being. So this is the key. This process of delimitation is the principle by which we arrive at an eventual ignorance. This subordinate process, he says, of the eternal seer and thinker, perfectly luminous, perfectly aware of himself and perfectly aware of himself and all, knowing well what he does, conscious of the infinite in the finite which he is creating, may be called the divine mind. And it is obvious that it must be a subordinate and not really a separate working of the real idea of the supermind, and must operate through what we have described as the apprehending movement of the truth consciousness. So this subordinate process by which the Creator delimits his own being and establishes the diversity of mind, life, and matter, each moving according to their own law of being, out and in, dividing and reaggregating, combining and separating. All of this is sustained in a function of consciousness which is an extension of that supramental. The supramental, he's described as the real idea, and this particular subordinate process of delimitation is the divine mind. Not mind as we experience it commonly, but a mind that's still in connection with the supramental agency. And it must be seen that this operates through what he has earlier called the apprehending movement of the truth consciousness. You may remember that there was that primary stage, that fundamental stage of the truth consciousness, in which a great extension, a massive expansion of its being was made available. Unity is the watchword of that condition. But out of that, there was the power of this divinity, this supramental being, to project itself, to confront itself, to apprehend itself, as if it were another being, but all the time it is that being, while it is the essential witness, undivided, and hence the multiplicity can emerge from the unity. That's the secondary poise and the apprehension of what stands in front is its feature, its fundamental feature. So now let's go to this next paragraph. That apprehending consciousness, the prajnana, places, as we have seen, the working of the indivisible all, active and formative, as a process and object of creative knowledge before the consciousness of the same all, originative and cognizant as the possessor and witness of its own working, somewhat as a poet views the creations of his own consciousness placed before him, in it, as if they were things other than the Creator and his creative force, yet all the time they are really no more than the play of self-formation of his own being in itself, and are indivisible there from their Creator. So again, a beautiful description, an aesthetic idea of how the divine reaches into manifestation from his own creative consciousness, casting forth forms which exist only in its consciousness. And what is consciousness but being? And why would it engage in this activity except for delight? And so, even as the elements of the play come into construction, to the outside viewer they may seem like they're separate, but they really always exist inside this one consciousness. And there is no outside viewer, is there? It is the only reality. So this apprehending consciousness that he's talking about, we first met, I think, in the chapter, The Supermind as Creator, where he described it as projecting, confronting, and apprehending. Later, he described a tertiary, a third poise of the supramental. If this is the second, there was the third, which was described as projecting, giving more emphasis to the projection of that reality into individual form, more emphasis on the diversity of form, although unity was always there in the backdrop, less so than in the mutuality of the second poise or in the absolute unity of the first. So here, again, he seems to be moving back to his original position that this could have been interpreted as tertiary poise here, but he's sticking with the idea that this is the apprehending consciousness. Thus, he writes, prajnana makes the fundamental division which leads to all the rest, the division of the Purusha, the conscious soul who knows and sees, and by his vision creates and ordains, and the Prakriti, the force soul or nature soul, which is his knowledge and his vision, his creation and his all-ordaining power. So this is a very different kind of Purusha and Prakriti than those whom we meet in the Sankhya philosophy, where Purusha is an abstract consciousness, absolutely divergent from all the play of nature. Sri Aurobindo insists on their ultimate unity as he describes it here. They are, as he continues, both are one being, one existence, and the forms seen and created are multiple forms of that being, which are placed by him as knowledge before himself as knower, by himself as force before himself as creator. So again, even though he takes multiple poises, he is the fundamental, undivided one, standing behind each and standing behind all. He is knowledge. He is the knower. He is the thing which is known. He is the creator. He is the force that has been created. He is the form that the force drives forward. All are part of his being, all are forms of his own self. The last action, Sri Aurobindo writes, of this apprehending consciousness takes place when the Purusha, pervading the conscious extension of his being, present at every point of himself as well as in his totality, inhabiting every form, regards the whole as if separately, from each of the standpoints he has taken. He views and governs the relations of each soul form of himself with other soul forms from the standpoint of will and knowledge appropriate to each particular form. So, in this, there is an overarching will that is affected in each particular. There can be no division of will because all is contained still within the one, and with that one standing and governing each as it moves in action in concert with the others, also views each of the others. So, soul sees into soul and sees the true intent, the one will expressing itself in harmony but variously in all the many that it has become. So it's not as if this many is not aware of the others. They are aware of each other, but aware of the one within themselves. The one stands here. The one stands there. There is only the one, but there is a truth in the diversity, which is now coming into prominence. And so, that leads us one step farther in the descent from the absolute unity of Satchit Ananda towards the manifestation that we know and love. Thus, the elements of division have come into being. First, the infinity of the one has translated itself into an extension in conceptual time and space. Secondly, the omnipresence of the one in that self-conscious extension translates itself into a multiplicity of the conscious soul, the many Purushas of the Sankhya. Thirdly, the multiplicity of soul forms has translated itself into a divided habitation of the extended unity. So there's the extension, the multiplicity, and then the apparent divided habitation. This divided habitation is inevitable the moment these multiple Purushas do not each inhabit a separate world of its own, do not each possess a separate prakriti, building a separate universe, but rather all enjoy the same prakriti, as they must do, being only soul forms of the one presiding over the multiple creations of his power. Yet, have relations with each other in the one world of being created by the one prakriti. So each is a soul form, but each accepts the large presentation of the all, of the cosmicity of that one come into prominent play. So we agree to play on this large stage and thus experience the same nature, even though we may experience our own justified swabhava, our own self-nature. We experience it within the context of the all. So he says, the Purusha in each form actively identifies himself with each. He delimits himself in that and sets off his other forms against it in his consciousness as containing his other selves, which are identical with him in being, but different in relation, different in the various extent, various range of movement, and various view of the one substance, force, consciousness, delight, which each is actually deploying at any given moment of time or in any given field of space. So again, this raises to us the image of the peacock fan, both feather and fan, because it's as if each eye is seeing the whole fan and sees himself in each other eye, feels himself as the one supporting the all, knows himself to be the one who has become the all. And so there's a multi-graded harmony. Each feather is slightly different, but essentially the same. Essentially grounded in the being of that one divine. And it is as if divided, right? And that recalls to us the translation Sri Aurobindo brought some pages back from the Bhagavad Gita, as if divided. Granted that in the divine existence, he says, perfectly aware of itself, this is not a binding limitation, not an identification to which the soul becomes enslaved and which it cannot exceed as we are enslaved to our self-identification with the body, unable to exceed the limitation of our conscious ego, unable to escape from a particular movement of our consciousness in time, determining our particular field in space. Granted all this, still there is a free identification from moment to moment, which only the inalienable self-knowledge of the divine soul prevents from fixing itself in an apparently rigid chain of separation and time succession, such as that in which our consciousness seems to be fixed and chained. So always at this level, at the divine level, even as it stations itself solidly in a particular form, it does not become enslaved. It can raise itself back into transcendence. It can arch upwards into the oneness of the all and escape rigidity. The form is not a cell, C-E-L-L. It is a habitation, and a shifting habitation. But for us here, with a limited mind, we have become identified with the fixity of our body. We think this is who we are. We think our life force is what energizes us, and we think our thoughts are what comprises our consciousness. And they become routinized. And that routine reflects the pattern of our life, and we think that's what we are. And we can, if we strive through yoga, get back to that experience of our transcendent self and climb back towards this truth which Sri Aurobindo is expressing so beautifully here. But it's not natural to the mind. We have to work effortfully to achieve that. And so this inalienable self-knowledge available to the divine soul may not be available to us here, but can become available to us as we grow. So this free identification, which he's described here, can lead later to a decoupling of the authentic self from the unity that all is. One can lose sight of the unity and then begin to feel, I am real, I'm not sure about that. I am a soul, I'm not sure who that is. Thus, the depiecing is already there. The relation of form with form as if they were separate beings, of will of being with will of being, as if they were separate forces, of knowledge of being with knowledge of being, as if they were separate consciousnesses, has already been founded. It is as yet only as if, for the divine soul is not deluded. It is aware of all as phenomenon of being and keeps hold of its existence in the reality of being. It does not forfeit its unity. It uses mind as a subordinate action of the infinite knowledge, a definition of things subordinate to its awareness of infinity, a delimitation dependent on its awareness of essential totality, not that apparent and pluralistic totality of sum and collective aggregation, which is only another phenomenon of mind. Thus, there is no real limitation. The soul uses its defining power for the play of well-distinguished forms and forces, and is not used by that power. So the soul is master of force and form at this level of being. This is still in the realm of the supramental that he describes. It is still sovereign over this aspect, but you can see how this delimitation, this decoupling, could eventually, in a different context, because this function has been permitted and is in fact necessary, could become a field of ignorance. And so now he gets down to brass tacks. A new factor, a new action of conscious force is therefore needed to create the operation of a helplessly limited as opposed to a freely limiting mind. That is to say, of mind subject to its own play and deceived by it as opposed to mind master of its own play and viewing it in its truth, the creature mind as opposed to the divine. That new factor is avidya, the self-ignoring faculty, which separates the action of mind from the action of the supermind that originated and still governs it from behind the veil. So this is a power of within the dividing, the distributing character of the mind to ignore itself. It is self-ignoring, and it is that self-ignoring function which allows this to come into being. Thus separated, mind perceives only the particular and not the universal, and is no longer both particular and universal as phenomena of the infinite. Now both of those things, the particular and the universal, and the at once view of them, all were part of the sovereign view of the divine soul. But now, with this descent into, you might describe it as self-forgetfulness, where we begin to ignore ourselves and enclose ourselves in our own camp and say, I, firmly I. Then that level of division is a limitation that blocks us from the experience of unity around. So he writes, thus we have the limited mind, which views every phenomenon as a thing in itself, separate part of a whole, which again exists separately in a greater whole, and so on, enlarging always its aggregates without getting back to the sense of a true infinity. So the mind, divided from the nature of the one, dwells in a power of consciousness where it feels comfortable within its own skin, but can't see the all around without trying to build an aggregate, tries to construct a whole, grabs particulars, pulls them together, feels that this is the world, and then sees more beyond, tries to grab those, pulls them back together. But because of its divided nature, because it stands in its self-division, based on its self-forgetting, self-ignorance, it cannot really see the infinite. It's a simulacrum that it creates, a version, a model of that, and then leans on that model as a reality. Much as we will look at the divine and create an institution and allow that institution to represent the divine to us, rather than having the essential experience of it, which would liberate us. If the mind would step out of its separation and embrace that unity, which is always secretly present, then its ignorance would disappear. But at this point, we're not thinking about how reunification can occur. We're looking more particularly into the action of delimitation. So, let's keep going. Mind, being an action of the infinite, depieces as well as aggregates ad infinitum. It cuts up being into wholes, into ever smaller wholes, into atoms, and those atoms into primal atoms, until it would, if it could, dissolve the primal atom into nothingness. But it cannot, because behind this dividing action is the saving knowledge of the supramental, which knows every whole, every atom to be only a concentration of all force, of all consciousness, of all being into phenomenal forms of itself. So, again, mind in its origination may undertake this function of decoupling or depiecing, but the division is not final, is not real. It doesn't have that power. It cannot thwart the unity that the supramental enforces by its very nature. But what he writes here about the primal atom will redound later when he approaches matter particularly. Remember, we're looking at mind, and then we'll look at life, and then we'll look at matter. When he gets to matter, what he has suggested here about the mind's insistence to try to divide and subdivide and divide still farther until you reach nothing is not true, and he says it is not true at the level of the material as well, so that there must be a basis to the universe. Else one would be left essentially with the idea that the universe could be an illusion. He refuses to admit that. So fundamental particles there must be to Sri Aurobindo. Something fundamental, particle or not. Let me revise that. The dissolution of the aggregate into an infinite nothingness at which mind seems to arrive is to the supermind only the return of the self-concentrating conscious being out of its phenomenon into its infinite existence. So, the nature of the pure consciousness has always the power and the freedom to resolve itself back into its essence. And he writes, whichever way its consciousness proceeds, by the way of infinite division or by the way of infinite enlargement, it arrives only at itself, at its own infinite unity and eternal being. So this is the truth of the supermind. Whatever play it undertakes, whatever process it enters into, it is always a field of its own making, of its own being. The processes, the methods that it's using are always of its own creation. Its destination is always its own truth. It arises out of its own truth, and then it debouches into its own truth. And when the action of the mind is consciously subordinate to this knowledge of the supermind, the truth of the process is known to it also and not at all ignored. So here, at this level, mind is working in a kind of wedded oneness to the supramental, and so is not actually in a state of ignorance. There is no real division, but only an infinitely multiple concentration into forms of being and into arrangements of the relation of those forms of being to each other, in which division is a subordinate appearance of the whole process necessary to their spatial and temporal play. So to populate the universe of time and space, it's necessary for this kind of distribution of being to occur. It is an action which is subordinated to the oneness, which is always the essential nature of the supramental, but this distribution must occur for there to be a cosmos. For divide as you will, he writes, get down to the most infinitesimal atom or form, the most monstrous possible aggregate of worlds and systems, you cannot get by either process to a thing in itself. All are forms of a force which alone is real in itself, while the rest are real only as self-imagings or manifesting self-forms of the eternal force consciousness. So above, in the previous paragraph, the mind, as it wants to lean upon its sense of separation, begins to regard everything as possibly a thing in itself. And he says here, it can't be, because there's only one. Only the reality really exists, yes? And so all are forms of a force which is alone real. Everything else is real by dint of its self-imaging. This creative consciousness, as a poet throwing out words, as an artist making shapes, filling them in with hues, exists in that consciousness, so are never separated from that real being. The real idea is there to sustain it. We cannot be separate, not really. Whence then does the limiting avidya, ignorance, the fall of mind from supermind, and the consequent idea of real division originally proceed? Exactly from what perversion of the supramental functioning? It proceeds from the individualized soul viewing everything from its own standpoint and excluding all others. It proceeds, that is to say, by an exclusive concentration of consciousness, an exclusive self-identification of the soul with a particular temporal and spatial action, which is only a part of its own play of being. It starts from the soul's ignoring the fact that all others are also itself, all other action, its own action, and all other states of being and consciousness, equally its own, as well as the action of the one particular moment in time and one particular standing point in space and the one particular form it presently occupies. It concentrates on the moment, the field, the form, the movement, so as to lose the rest. It has then to recover the rest by linking together the succession of moments, the succession of points of space, the succession of forms in time and space, the succession of movements in time and space. It has thus lost the truth of the indivisibility of time, the indivisibility of force and substance. So this is an enclosing concentration. This is an exclusive action. Exclusive in the sense that you're excluding others. You're saying, this is real, that is not. This is valuable, that is not. This I affirm, that I deny. It has lost sight even of the obvious fact that all minds are one mind taking many standpoints, all lives one life developing many currents of activity, all body and form one substance of force and consciousness, concentrating into many apparent stabilities of force and consciousness. But in truth, all these stabilities are really only a constant whirl of movement, repeating a form while it modifies it. They are nothing more. One substance of force and consciousness. One being, manifoldly distributed. This is the truth. But is it what the mind experiences? For the mind, he writes, tries to clamp everything into rigidly fixed forms and apparently unchanging or unmoving external factors, because otherwise it cannot act. Because it lives in that sense of separation. It's overwhelmed by the experience of the all, of the universal. It then thinks it has got what it wants. In reality, all is a flux of change and renewal, and there is no fixed form in itself, and no unchanging external factor. To that extent, Buddhism and certain Vedantic schools have a truth behind their philosophy. Only the eternal, real idea is firm, and maintains a certain ordered constancy of figures and relations in the flux of things, a constancy which the mind vainly attempts to imitate by attributing fixity to that which is always inconstant. And this is the truth of a larger Vedanta, which swallows up the idea of the flux within its own truth. The flux occurs within a constant being. And the many who arise and the many who go are always that one being. And there is no want of authenticity, no want of knowledge, of self-empowerment, no want of delight at that level of transcendent self-experience. But again, we're talking about the mind. These truths, mind has to rediscover. It knows them all the time, but only in the hidden back of its consciousness, in the secret light of its self-being. And that light is to it a darkness, because it has created the ignorance, because it has lapsed from the dividing into the divided mentality, because it has become involved in its own workings and in its own creations. So if the mind, as an adjunct to the supramental, is meant to give stress to the delimiting force, is meant to give an authentic expression in the arisal of the many, of the diversity, and to stand in each of those many elements of the diverse. Having left the dividing function and become divided, it has now lapsed into ignorance. Literally, it is ignoring itself. And it is there which we find the mind's principal difficulty to exist. It has become enmeshed, involved, encased in its own creations, its own empowerments. And since all it can do is try to build aggregates, it cannot get back to the unity, which is its real source of strength and its real source of being. I think this is a good place to put our markers for this week. And next time we'll take up the next paragraph, which begins, "This ignorance is farther deepened." There's a beautiful passage in Savitri. If you're still interested in sublime poetry, I'd like to share this with you. This is from the Book of Beginnings, the first book, and the third canto, the Yoga of the Soul's Release. Immense realities took on a shape. There looked out from the shadow of the unknown, the bodiless namelessness that saw God born and tries to gain from the mortal's mind and soul a deathless body and a divine name. The immobile lips, the great surreal wings, the visage masked by superconscient sleep, the eyes with their closed lids that see all things, appeared of the architect who builds in trance. The original desire, born in the void, peered out. He saw the hope that never sleeps, the feet that run behind a fleeting fate, the ineffable meaning of the endless dream. Hardly for a moment glimpsed, viewless to mind, as if a torch held by a power of God, the radiant world of the everlasting truth glimmered like a faint star bordering the night, above the golden overmind's shimmering ridge. Even were caught, as through a cunning veil, the smile of love that sanctions the long game, the calm indulgence and maternal breasts of wisdom, suckling the child laughter of chance, silence, the nurse of the Almighty's power, the omniscient hush, womb of the immortal word, and of the timeless, the still brooding face, and the creative eye of eternity. So I thank you for your time, your attention, and as always, your patience. Jai Ma. Namaste.